Hello, welcome. Um, I am Rebecca Bray, the Executive Director at the Center for Artistic Activism. It's really wonderful to see everybody here. We're so glad you can make it. It's nice to see so many familiar names, and there are also many of you who are new to us, so welcome. If you're new to us, the Center for Artistic Activism is an educational and research nonprofit. We're a 501c3 organization. We help groups and individuals do nonviolent, creative, and effective advocacy work. So we've been around since 2009. We work with people all over the world, from voting rights organizations all over the US to LGBTQ plus advocates in Africa to climate justice organizations in South Asia and many, many more. We've provided training to hundreds of organizations and thousands of activists, helping them really bring imagination and emotion and joy and humor and experimentation to their campaigns. So today's event, Anti-Authoritarian Artistic Activism, is part of our work to share helpful, inspiring information about how creative resistance can win. And I'm very excited to introduce my colleagues, Steve Duncombe and Blythe Kim, who will be leading today. And I also want to introduce you to Rachel Gita Karp and Crystal Barrett, who will be answering questions in the chat. So if you experience any issues, you can message one of them directly. Throughout today's session, they'll also be sharing your questions and reflections that you put in the chat. Only they will be able to see them, or all of us will be able to see them, but not everyone. But there are hundreds of you here today, so maybe won't be able to get to all the comments and questions, but we really are looking forward to hearing from you in the chat, and we'll respond to everything that we can. So with that, I'll hand it over to Steve and Blythe. Take it away.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, my name is Blythe. I'm the communications manager here at the Center for Artistic Activism, and we are so grateful to see so much interest in this topic around artistic activism and how it can be used against authoritarianism, especially since this is the first in a series of public events on anti-authoritarianism we're hosting this fall. And let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. Today is a conversation about how creativity can help people resist authoritarianism and protect our democracy. We're going to look at some basic definitions, hear real stories from activists and artists who use creativity and imagination to make resistance visible when dissent was silenced. And then we're going to try some brainstorming tactics and strategies together. So this isn't a heavy academic lecture or technical training on political strategy, and it's not about art for art's sake. We're talking about creativity as resistance and imagination as a tool for change. So hopefully we'll be able to use this space to connect what's happening around the world to what's happening here. And hopefully leave feeling empowered to bring creativity into your own actions. And with that, I'll introduce my co-facilitator today, Steve Duncombe, to talk about authoritarianism.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Duncombe, and I'm the co-founder and research director of the Center for Artistic Activism. And we're so happy to have you here in these really, really dark times. And as Blythe pointed out, what we want to do is start with just some basic definitions to get us on the same page. And so we're talking about authoritarianism. Well, what do we mean by authoritarianism? The first thing to think about with authoritarianism is there is no one model of authoritarianism. There's different authoritarianisms in different places in the world and at different times in the world. Yet they do share some basic characteristics. A political system where power is concentrated, civil liberties are repressed, media and public expression are controlled, coercion and force are commonplace, marginal groups are scapegoated, and the rule of law is ignored. And really important is that authoritarianism often makes its popular appeal and gains its popular support by making emotional and not rational appeals. And that's really important for artistic activism, right, Blythe?
Yep. So let's talk about what is artistic activism. We describe it as this hybrid practice. One combines the effect of the arts with the effect of activism, creating what we like to call affect. It's a practice that taps into emotions and mobilizes them into action because when people feel something, they're far more likely to do something. Both authoritarianism and artistic activism rely on this emotional appeal. It's their common ground. And authoritarian movements use fear, anger, and nostalgia to gain this control, while artistic activism, by contrast, we like to use hope and humor and empathy and imagination to move people towards making actions for freedom and justice. So this emotional dimension is what makes artistic activism so powerful and why we need to use it with care, as it is incredibly potent. We like to think that all successful activism is artistic activism because at its core, it moves not just through policy or logic, but through our shared humanity. And with that, I'll pass it back to Steve.
Yeah, and probably the best way to really define artistic activism and define artistic activism at a time of authoritarianism is actually to look at examples. Unfortunately, authoritarianism is not new, and authoritarianism is not something which is limited to the United States. And so we're going to show you some examples. These are not comprehensive. We are putting together a much larger list, which we'll share out with you in the future. So sign up for our newsletter. That's going to go into much more detail and offer a lot more lessons. But we just picked a handful of examples from around the world that we thought actually would be both insightful but also useful for all of us. But before we begin, there's something really important, which is these aren't going to work for you. Um, that is to say that each of these examples was created at a particular time for a particular context. It worked in that moment. It won't necessarily work transported to something else because context matters, particularly when we're dealing with artistic activism, which resonates with culture. We all have culture, but we all have different cultures. So it's really important to think about how can we learn something from these examples, but not just replicate the examples. But still, we can learn a lot from them. And so we're going to start our first example with the civil rights movement in the United States. And it may seem sort of strange to begin a discussion of creative resistance to authoritarianism with the US as an example. Until recently, weren't we the land of the free, the world's oldest constitutional democracy? Yeah, for some of us, that's true. But not if you were Black, when you were poor, and you were living in the South in the mid 20th century. It was a time when you had no vote, you had no freedoms, no rule of law, and there was institutionalized violence. In other words, you were living under an authoritarian regime. But people resisted and they protested. And next slide. In amazing protests like this. And often when we think of protest, we think of events like this March for Jobs and Freedom in Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. And it was effective. It led to the Civil Rights Act being passed a year later. And we often use it, maybe until recently, as an example that celebrates the American tradition of First Amendment freedoms and the effectiveness of mass demonstration. Um, but it was an exception. Far more typical were protests like this. This is the Selma to Montgomery March, the first Selma to Montgomery March on March 7th, 1965. About 600 protesters took part in this. Most of them were Black, mostly poor, and this is how it ended. With tear gas, with batons. It was called Bloody Sunday for a reason. But what was interesting was, for our purposes, is not the violence of the white supremacist state, but how the civil rights movement responded to it. What they did is, back up one slide, thanks, is that civil rights group leaders regrouped and reimagined. They knew that they couldn't do the same march over again and hope for a different result. So they put out a call to religious leaders all across the United States. Um, and a few weeks later, on March 25th, 25,000 people showed up to participate, including, I don't know if you know this, Blythe, my father, who was a young minister at that time. And with these often white clergy people out up in front, and you also notice the small kids that are out in front of the protest, the authorities did not use violence. And not only that, it got very positive press coverage and international press coverage, which then actually brought to light the violence that had happened 2 weeks ago as well. And this was a strategy that the civil rights movement used over and over and over again. And next slide. Whether it was Rosa Parks, for example, who kind of played this every woman, even though she was a very skilled organizer and refusing to give up her seat on a bus, or the young college students who would sit down at a Woolworths and demand to be served, but who were trained very carefully beforehand to not react and to let the other people react, or to use children, school children. This is from the Children's Crusade of the Birmingham protests, in which using children as protesters because they made for good pictures. In fact, the whole Birmingham protest, in many ways, was created as a staged campaign to expose authoritarian repression. So, what can we learn from this? The most important thing to learn is to innovate and don't just replicate. Power adapts to our tactics and to control them and to repress them and to turn them against us. What we need to do is constantly be reimagining and recreating tactics that stay a step ahead. And also to take into account the context in which we're operating and not merely repeat things over and over because people have done them before. Context change, we need to change. Blythe?
Yeah, so we have a question for all of our attendees today around this example and this lesson, which is how might you reimagine a conventional form of protest you currently practice? So we're all going to take a moment to jot down or type your thoughts in the chat, and Rachel and Crystal, our top moderators, are going to be reviewing them and be happy to share them out for us. And while you do, I want to kind of like what helps me in these moments is ruminate out loud, or like one of my friends told me the term rubber ducking, of just like talking out the question. And so I'm curious to know like what was maybe your first protest or your most recent protest, and how would you go about doing that differently? The times are different, the audience is different. We had our No Kings protest in June, and we're about to have the second one this Saturday. If you went to the first one and you're planning to go to this one, like how are you going to reimagine your presence in that space?
Yeah, we have a few folks in the chat mentioning some of the tactics in Portland, like dressing up as frogs or maybe bringing real frogs. I'm not sure. Also dance parties this weekend, street theater, dressing up as the Statue of Liberty. Yeah, more
I like
about
that.
Portland and circus clowns, anything to ruin propaganda videos.
Yeah, we have
Great.
others saying using humor is especially effective now. A huge fan of circus, bread and puppet style. We have a lot coming in.
Oh yeah.
More costumes. Doing
I
things
love the
Spanish.
idea of magicians.
Jack mentioned bringing a bubble machine. How delightful.
And environmental,
I love
hopefully.
the delightful part of that.
Whimsy.
Someone also, Juniper mentioned dressing up as Disney characters so that no footage can be used without a lawsuit.
Love that.
That's very smart. That's very
But and
smart.
just remember, sometimes a big mass protest is fine.
Mhm.
It doesn't mean you always just have to innovate for innovation's sake. It's but thinking about the timing, the protest, what you're facing, and then adapting to that is really, I think, the lesson there.
I love how much people are having ideas. And I'm going to move us forward to our next example, which is, as you might have recognized, we're going to be talking about these ideas of protest dolls that have been used in Russia. And when we mention artistic activism in Russia, most people think of this loud, brash, audacious actions of kind of incredible feminist punk rock group who we heard at the beginning of this session, Pussy Riot. They gained this global notoriety back in 2012 when their 5 members staged a guerrilla performance inside Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. It was bold, it was brash, it was brave, and it caught the world's attention. But it also came at an unfortunately very high cost for their most visible members of Pussy Riot, who were arrested, who were sent to prison. And it's this powerful reminder that being an identifiable activist can also carry some serious risk. And so we're talking about for the women of Pussy Riot, while we completely commend this incredible courage, not everyone is able to afford to take that risk. Whether it's where we live or we're caregivers who care for an aging parent or a child, it's simply a risk that we can't take in losing our job or our freedom. And today, that danger is ever more real in Russia, where you can be jailed for up to 15 years for protesting the war in Ukraine. So people have found some safer and more creative ways to speak out. And this is one of those examples where artistic activists in St. Petersburg began creating tiny doll protesters with small handmade figures holding protest signs left in these public spaces and photographed to be shared online. This one is carrying a sign that says, "Russia for peace, stop your war." She's not a famous activist. She's just an everyday woman, and that's the point. So our lesson from this example is use the power of anonymity. Anonymity can be powerful. It's not just safe, it's mysterious. When no one knows who did it, anyone could have. And that means everyone might be an activist because we're everywhere. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Steve to talk us through our question.
Yeah, what we'd love for you to put up in the chat is give some thought to um, like what an intervention that you could create that would allow people to participate anonymously, right? So some sort of intervention that's public, that gets seen, but where people can actually participate anonymously. Um, and so one of the ways you can think of, I'm just going to talk, keep typing, don't listen to me. I'm going to be your background noise. Is you might want to think about everyday ways that you're anonymous by wearing a costume, for example, during Halloween, or creating ghost social media accounts in order to sign up for things you don't want to get mail on. We actually practice anonymity all the time. Maybe we could apply some of those methods of anonymity to an intervention. Maybe you could leverage anonymity, it's a hard word to say, anonymity to support the work you're already doing or bring additional folks into your work. So what's ways people can participate and have plausible deniability? So think about those and write some of your ideas up in the chat and we'll share them out.
Yeah, a lot of folks are mentioning stickers,
Yeah.
and how you can put them in central places where people can get them and then share them out in their own time. Also, someone also mentioned sending postcards with secrets and also like doing origami and putting messages inside the origami.
I love that. Crafty. I love a good craft.
Yeah. I saw someone had posted something about everybody wearing the same clothing. And that was actually done in Poland. And during some of the protests at the end of the communist regime there, where they would ask people to go out wearing orange to support the demonstrations. And you could wear orange, and if the police said, "Well, why are you wearing orange?" I just wear orange. That's I'm just wearing orange. So everybody could see. So it often offered that plausible deniability. It's a great example. All right, ready to go to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next example we have is from the city of Chongqing, which is in southwest China, where urban pollution is a big problem. I don't know if anybody's been to a Chinese city, well, in the past decade or so, but about 15 years ago, I went to a major city and gave up smoking. The smog was so bad that my lungs hurt, and I was only there for a week or so. And so it's a real problem. Now, the officials understood it was a problem. They officially declared a war on smog, but because of corruption and lack of will, nothing really got done. You know, if you don't live in an authoritarian regime, what do? You go out and you protest. You write letters to your politicians. You get letters to the editor to put in the paper. You can't do any of that in China. Protest is illegal. And so what a bunch of environmental activists did in this city was really clever. In the main tourist section of the city, they staged a series of interventions of activities like a solemn march, a ballerina recital, couples having wedding photos taken, all wearing gas masks. And instead of overtly critiquing the government, they celebrated the state policy and called their protest a war on smog. Now, this has a long tradition. We have a Chinese colleague in our research group who told me about this. There's a long tradition in China that one of the ways that you protest is you actually do things in the name of supporting the regime, but actually what you're doing is you're critiquing the regime. And so they borrowed that strategy and they called their protest the war on smog. And while they were celebrating the policy, the gas masks visually told a very different story, that the war on smog was a war that was being lost. People who saw it understood that it was a protest against pollution and government inaction. But because it didn't look like a protest and they weren't calling it a protest, the police didn't stop it. And more so because it wasn't a protest, it got covered by the Chinese as well as foreign media. An incredibly clever strategy. So what's the lesson here? Create protests that don't look like protests. When a protest looks like a protest, you know what to do. If you agree with the cause, you join it. And if you're with the police, you shut it down. But a protest that doesn't look like a protest offers a way to safely protest and participate without being shut down. You can create arresting images without getting arrested. And so, Blythe, do we have a question that we want people to look at?
Yes, we do. Our question with this lesson is, how might you stage your protest that doesn't look like a protest, but still gets your message across? So when I saw this one, it made me think of this video I saw with this comedian named Suzanne Lambert, and it looked like a normal social media makeup tutorial, but it actually was a MAGA branded makeup tutorial. And she played it completely straight using humor, irony, and exaggeration to make a political point without really blatantly saying so. And for me, it was a great reminder that activism doesn't always have to look like activism. So with this, I'd like to really ask, while you're typing, to think about what could you create that would like fake or create satire around like admiration or celebration, and how would you do it? Like social media is a great way to do it. And even if like you are thinking of examples that you've seen that are creative actions that didn't look like protests, but still were able to carry a powerful message.
Lindsay mentioned Billionaires for Bush, which kind of was a different take on this for folks who know that example. Other folks are mentioning choir groups singing resistance songs, puppet shows.
We have poetry readings or poetry slams, local improv groups and comedy shows, celebratory parade.
Mhm.
Use someone says older people all using walkers at once to circle and
Yeah.
protect people.
I,
So
I
that if
love
police
that.
intervene, they would have to be knocking over older folks.
Mm. These are some great creative ideas and
Yeah.
entertaining. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. And keep
Um,
thinking of them.
Keep putting them in the chat. We're going to be sharing them out in our follow-up as well, so we can all enjoy them.
So
Our
Blythe, what's this one?
our next one is also from China, which is the white paper protests, which actually we'll say erupted in late 2020 in response to China's very rigid zero COVID policies, where once again, people weren't allowed to gather in large groups or hold up protest signs. So, what did they do? In cities across China, citizens stood silently in these public spaces holding up blank sheets of paper. And these empty pages became a powerful symbol of censorship, this way to show that their voices had been erased, yet here they still were, visible and refusing to disappear. This silence, this absence, became the message, turning the nothingness into this pointed act of resistance. And because this created a blank space where anything could be there, people were projecting their own frustrations, fears, and hopes while skirting these laws that banned these political placards from the people. And so, with this, we want to employ the lesson around exploiting the ambiguity because sometimes these blank spaces can speak louder than protest signs. Their silence speaks volumes about censorship, but the ambiguity allowed the others to participate by quite literally filling in the blank. And Steve, I know you had your own great example around the idea of ambiguity.
Yeah, when we first came across this example, it made me think of Abby Hoffman, who's sort of like a patron saint of artistic activism. Abby Hoffman was a organizer with the Yippie Party in the 1960s. And when he would do television interviews, he would purposefully swear, knowing he would get bleeped out. And he did that because he said that the bleeps were far more articulate about both government repression, but also far more radical than anything he could possibly say, because people would fill in the blank and say, well, he must have been saying something really important for the media to censor him. And so people have been using these ideas of voids and blank spaces. And we'd like you to actually think about how you might design an action that leaves spaces for people to fill in answers instead of providing them. The best artistic activism, we think, is actually one that poses questions and lets people fill in the answers as opposed to telling people what to think. Telling people what to think is authoritarian. But posing questions that allow people space and place to actually say something, express themselves, is by its very nature democratic. One of our favorite artistic activists, and you should be typing while I'm talking. One of our favorite artistic activists is named Candy Chang, and she does a lot of these interventions where she just has a simple question that she asks and then leaves a blank space for people to fill those things in. And so might want to think about how could you design an action that leaves spaces for people to fill in answers.
Yeah, other folks in the chat mentioned Candy Chang. Someone also mentioned Mad Libs, or a memorial,
Ah,
a memorial in Berlin that had empty bookshelves to represent books burned by Nazis. Kelsey,
mm,
white flags.
Empty picture frames.
yeah.
unroll a large scroll of paper in a public place.
Nice. Great ideas.
Mhm. Um,
All right, shall we? There's so many good ideas. Please keep thinking. Maybe there's some way we could collect them and make a document that we
Yeah,
can share out with
definitely.
people.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great. We're going to actually go to a different part of the world right now, to the Balkans. We're going to start with Serbia. And following the dissolution of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, I said it right when we were practicing. I could not say that name correctly. I said it correctly, I believe, unless you're Serbian, and I probably butchered it. But in any case, Slobodan Milosevic instituted an authoritarian and quite genocidal regime in Serbia. And in response, in 1998, a group of student activists calling themselves Otpor, which is Serbian for resistance, formed to protest the regime, which was a very dangerous proposition. One couldn't organize in public, and people were afraid to participate in protests. So what they did is they drew upon this old Yugoslav tradition of placing boxes in shops and public places, asking people to donate 1 dinar, which is the Serbian currency, for some sort of social project, like sowing and planting crops and so on. It was very much part of the sort of socialist culture of Yugoslavia at the time. But what they did is they created their own collection barrel called Dinar for Change. They put it in a public space, and it consisted of a big barrel with a photo of Milosevic right on the front. And people could donate 1 dinar, and then they would get a stick, which they could use to hit the barrel. And then there was a sign that suggested if people did not have any money because of Milosevic's politics, they should hit the barrel twice. When the police finally removed the barrel, Otpor stated in a press release that the initiative was a huge success, and they had collected enough money for Milosevic's retirement, and the police, which have now gathered the barrel, would pass the money on to him. And what we love about this example is it's an example that encourages participation, which is it created opportunities for other people to join in your action. And they were relatively safe because the people that put in the dinar or picked up the stick were not the organizers of it. They were just people walking by in the street. So they got us a bit of liability. And the organizers were often the crowd, so they were relatively safe. And too often, protest is something which is done by protesters and watched by others. Not only does this make it really easy to target those who are protesting, but it also creates a separation between those who act and those who watch. So by creating simple and safe ways to participate, we can turn watchers into doers and make it also harder to be identified and target individuals as the activists. So we got a question for you too.
Yeah. Our question is, how might you build your own action that depends on participation? And we really want to be thinking about how do we make that participation safe? If we want people to join in, we need to give them that clear invitation, and simple instructions on how they can actually take part. So, like, how would you do that? Is that something you say? Is that written somewhere? Is it like seeing other people do it as well? I also like to think about maybe the last time I participated in something that I didn't plan, whether that was a party, a rally, a flash mob, which I didn't because I don't dance, or like art in action. So, like, what about that made you join? What made a what about that made it feel easy or exciting or safe or not? Safety wasn't a thing that you had to think about.
Um,
What, Rachel, do we
there's
have any good ideas?
Yeah, there's some great game ideas, including a yard game from Eric to knock down the pillars of our autocracy. And you could do that at parties
Great.
or rallies. Um, coloring pages, a community board, hopscotch.
I love that.
A few hopscotch ideas.
I love the idea of including like child-friendly activities to like have it be more of a intergenerational participation.
Mhm.
I'm gonna move us forward with our potholes example that we love to share out.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to stay in the Balkans for this one. Uh, Moving a little bit down south, staying in the Western Balkans to the nation of North Macedonia, which was also led by an authoritarian regime following the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Um, and about a dozen years ago, a group of artists and activists from the capital city of Skopje went to the countryside to organize anti-authoritarian resistance. They were idealistic, they were young, they were really militant. And what they found was one, that people were too scared to be identified as political. It was a really risky proposition to put yourself out as political. Very divisive times, just like in our time. People didn't want to alienate their neighbors. They also didn't want to attract attention from the police. So that was one of the problems. The second problem is actually people didn't want to talk about politics. What they really wanted to talk about was potholes. They said to these activists, our town's falling apart. Potholes are everywhere. And the government's doing nothing about it. They take any money that's allocated for repair and they end up stealing it for themselves. So, what these anti authoritarian artistic activists turned their attention to was potholes. And they came up with really, really clever tactics. Upon hearing that one of the potholes had not been fixed for 2 years, they threw it a birthday party. They got a cake, they got streamers, and they threw it a birthday party. And the media heard about it. They showed up and they put it on national news. In another pothole that had been filled with water, um, they went fishing. Full fishing garb with rods, reels, nets. And if you look at that orange bucket to the bottom there, that actually has a fish in it. They went to a fish store and bought a fish. And periodically, when nobody was looking, they'd throw it back out on the line and then reel it in. And people came, they talked, they laughed. And one of the things they started talking about while laughing was that the government wasn't doing anything for them. They were just lining their own pockets. The next example was also one with a waterborne or a water-filled pothole, which is outside of a school. And what they did is they added rubber ducks. Um, and rubber ducks are actually a symbol of a corruption. Started out in Brazil. It's also used in Southeast Asia, Russia, and the Balkans. I'm not quite sure what the connection is, but it is there. And kids ended up playing with the rubber ducks. And then the artistic activists took photos of this and spread them on social media. And you know what? It worked. They, the government was so embarrassed, local government was so embarrassed that they ended up fixing the potholes. But that was never really the point. The point was getting people to understand that they could stand up to the government and make the government serve the people instead of just serving the people in power. And the lesson that they taught us was that sometimes it's best actually to protest non-political issues or apolitical issues that exemplify politics. The potholes are never about potholes, they're about government inaction to the needs of everyday people. But to say that was too risky for activists and to everyday people afraid of being targeted as political. So potholes became a way to talk about and mobilize people around politics. For those of you that live in New York City or perhaps have heard news about our mayoral candidate, Zohar Mamdani, you might have heard about his social media campaign about halal carts being too expensive. It was never about halal carts. It was a really clever media campaign, but it was really used as a way to draw attention to speculative food card licensing. And so he's been doing that work of picking apolitical issues, but using them to highlight things like wealth inequality, government corruption, and so on. So we got a question for you.
Yeah, we do. What is your apolitical issue that you might build a protest around that's going to get at a larger political issue. So exploring this perspective, I guess, what is that one everyday thing that affects us all pretty much equally that has been largely affected for the worse by government intervention? And when I thought of this question, I was thinking about the price of eggs. During the pandemic, like eggs were the cheapest thing that you could get, and they've only been on the rise. So, like, what is the political action you could do about the rising price of eggs? But that's my idea. We want to hear your ideas.
Traffic, the weather, a few people mentioning traffic. Um, oh, trees being cut down, street safety,
Mm.
tree cover, trash, electricity costs.
That's a big one.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a way to build break down boundaries around political ideology. Everybody drops a tire into a pothole. Everybody has to worry about the price of eggs or electricity. And so by picking these apolitical, quote unquote, issues, you can actually bring more people together around political causes. So what's the three finger salute, Blythe?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about some symbols. We have about 17 minutes left, so we're going to try and get everyone out of here on time. So in 2021, there was a military coup in Myanmar where people had found this simple but powerful way to show their own defiance. They began raising their three fingers, a portable and wordless sign of unity and resistance. The reason is that this was brilliant is simply its simplicity. It's a gesture that anyone could make anytime, anywhere. It's not a sign or a t-shirt that you have to have with you. It was easy to produce and it made it onto posters and memes and street art. It made it almost impossible to censor, and it even spread across to different countries where citizens in Thailand adopted the same salute to protest their own military coup. And so our lesson is how creating symbols of resistance can be easy, emulatable, and ubiquitous because political movements need these symbols that are easy to display and replicate when symbols help people find each other and build this solidarity. So we like to think of the peace sign, the raised fist, and unfortunately, even on the other side of fascist salute. So symbols shape this belonging. And so our question, Steve.
Is what's an easy and emulatable symbol that expresses anti-authoritarianism that we might be able to make popular? Purple cow.
The hand over mouth. The Star Trek Long Live and Prosper. My hand can't do that, but I wish I could. Mostly because I'm an NERD fan.
And
yes,
the
and
window at night, pussy hats as a past example.
The frog
yeah.
is coming up again.
Yeah, watermelon is a great example of that.
I saw someone already mention and noticed that the three finger salute is not from politics, but from pop culture and the hit movie franchise, The Hunger Games, which brings us to our next example, which is the Straw Hat Jolly Roger. Across these past few years, in especially Gen Z-led protests across the globe, protesters have been flying this very unexpected flag, the Straw Hat Pirates Jolly Roger, from the manga and anime One Piece. It first started in Indonesia and quickly spread across borders, across issues, where this cartoon skull wearing a straw hat, borrowed from popular culture, was reimagined as this symbol of defiance. And it works. It works because it's culturally familiar, yet politically nonspecific, instantly recognizable to this younger generation, and as you can see, remixable in these different prints and stickers, and definitely harder to ban than a national or party flag. So, because this is a pop culture icon rather than a formal political insignia, the flag's able to travel across borders and across issues. So with that, our lesson is drawing upon popular culture for symbols and stories that can spread. And seeing that this is popular culture is popular for a reason. It already is resonating with people and connecting with their everyday hopes, humor, and imagination. So when we use what's popular, we can make anti-authoritarianism unpopular too.
Yeah. And we want you to brainstorm just for a minute or so on what current popular culture might we draw upon in our resistance to authoritarianism. Once when we were doing a workshop, we were working with Muslim American groups who were trying to figure out some strategies against police surveillance. And on our cultural outing, we were way out in rural New York. We went to the local mall and saw a movie, and it was Fast and Furious. And then we came back the next morning and said, well, this is an incredibly popular franchise. What can we learn from it? And some of the organizers said, well, Fast and Furious is really about this sort of multi-culti, ragtag bunch of people who band together. They're sort of like a non-biological family who is fighting for justice and against the man. They also blow up a lot of cars and drive too fast and shit like that. But what they really kind of narrowed in on was the DNA of its popularity and said, well, we can brand ourselves that way too. That's what we are. And we always thought that that was such a brilliant idea, is to be able to draw from something as seemingly radically divergent as Fast and Furious and bring it to their struggle. So what sort of popular culture are people writing about?
Yeah, someone was saying the Star Wars Rebellion logo still hits hard.
Yeah.
The V for Vendetta mask, I remember that one a lot in past actions. K-pop Demon Hunters, that's really big right now. Lord of the Rings. Someone said kites.
All right. Well, keep thinking, and we're going to move on. Toward This is our last example, and it comes from South Africa, and it goes back a little bit to the authoritarian regime of apartheid in South Africa and the popular resistance against it. Um, the repression against the resistance to apartheid was brutal. Police routinely beat and shot protesters. Most notoriously, of course, was the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, when police killed 69 people. In response, South African activists designed a new style of protest march, drawing on training exercises from freedom fighters in nearby Zimbabwe. Protesters created the Toy Toy. Um, and it's kind of a half dance, half high step march, jog, and it's accompanied by chanting and singing. And it's really a powerful statement of resistance. It's intimidating to authorities, but because it's nonviolent and just a dance, it doesn't provoke violence. It's also very joyful. And I think that's a key part, which is if anybody's been to a protest in South Africa, and I saw Brett name pop up, so I know he has, but we've done a lot of work in South Africa at CF4AA and with South African colleagues and comrades. And one of the things that always strikes me about South African protests is you can't go to one without singing or dancing, and that joy is par for the course with in South African protests. And I think that's a really important lesson in these dark times, which is resistance can be joyful, even in the worst of times. Um, it's important to remember what demonstrate means. We always say we're going to a demonstration, but it should also demonstrate what we want in the world. Our demonstration should demonstrate not just what we're against, but also what we're for. And so our final question for you is, what might a joyful protest look like?
Yeah, we really want to be centering solution and not the problem. Having gratitude for what exists and not really griping or complaining. especially when we think about how authoritarianism wants us to believe that their world is the only one that's possible. And employing joy, especially employing collective joy, is how we can prove them wrong. And so we would love to hear your ideas of how you can employ joy.
And while you're writing those, can you go to the next slide?
Yep.
This has come up a lot. People have been talking about what's been happening in Portland. And, one of the things for those who don't know is that, protesters in Portland have started to show up in ridiculous and ridiculously cute costumes. And it's brilliant. One, it's joyful, but two, it also plays against the idea of that Portland's under siege by these anarchists from Antifa who are, preaching destruction and so on and so forth. It's easy to make a case against someone with a balaclava. It's much harder to make a case against someone arresting, I don't even know what a unicorn. And so we found this recent approach to joy in Portland really inspiring. So what's inspiring you?
Lots of things. Kazoos, dances.
I see Labubu. I didn't know what Labubu was until I saw it in an ICE protest.
And that crosses into the popular culture too.
Yeah.
Someone said the time warp dance could be done
Yes.
together, linking arms, singing "This land is your land."
It's beautiful.
People painting rainbows on their driveways in Florida, Tulsa, since there have been all these other laws against painting rainbows other places.
Lovely. All right. We have so many more that we could share with you, but we want you to remember this. Don't replicate, innovate. These won't work for you because context matters, but we can still learn from them. We can still be inspired from them and take away lessons from this. And I hope that's actually what's happened here, which is we succeed by thinking creatively and how to address problems today in our own unique circumstances. And at C4A, that's what we try to do, is we help organizations develop creative actions that are situated to whatever culture and whatever the political context is in which they find themselves.
So thank you so much, Steve and Blythe. That was really fantastic. So many great insights in such a short amount of time. And thank you to all of you for your incredible comments and ideas. As we've mentioned, we will be sharing out the many wonderful things that came up in the chat when we follow up with you. I'm very curious about what all of you have found most inspiring and helpful from this, and what you'd like to learn more about, and how you might be applying these ideas to your work. I see that there are lots of ideas floating around already. But that's what we do. We help advocates to apply these kinds of principles in very practical ways, but also very wild ways. So if you work in an organization and you're interested in how you can apply this kind of research to your campaigns or your strategy, get in touch. We offer workshops in campaign planning, and we can speak at convenings. And so there should be a link in the chat to the Work With Us form. And thank you. I also want to encourage you to donate. So if you found this session at all helpful, please consider it. As I'm sure you know, support for nonprofit organizations is under attack and being threatened, and we can only offer programs like this with support. So any amount makes a difference. Maybe you want to contribute the equivalent of buying Steve and Blythe some cups of coffee, or maybe a nice meal. There's a link in the chat to the donate area, and it's very easy. And thank you so much if you can. Your contributions really ensure that we're able to provide more events like these, which, speaking of which, as we mentioned, we're going to have another event next month. We're planning an upcoming workshop on the authoritarian playbook and how we can counter it at every single step. The initial presentation will be followed up with meetings for folks that want some additional support as they put the ideas into practice. So we'll announcing the we'll be announcing the date for that in the next few weeks, so be sure to get on our mailing list. The link is in the chat, and so please join. So if you're on the newsletter, you'll get invites to events like that. We're also offering special office hours for organizations, which is a chance to talk with our team one-on-one to talk about your campaigns. We also will be sharing our upcoming research report that Steve mentioned on anti-authoritarian artistic activism, which will include even more than what we were able to share today, along with other tools and resources. So there's just one more thing. We would really love to hear what was useful to you from today. Your feedback very much helps us to provide the best possible resources. So in the chat, could you please take a moment to tell us something that you found useful from this session? I'm very curious about whether some of you are planning things for Saturday or maybe a longer term campaign, and what really resonates with you that that you want to apply to something that you're working on. And we'd also love to find out if there's something that we didn't talk much about that you'd like to know more about. This will help us planning future events and resources. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to put that. I see lots of things coming in the chat. So we'll give you a moment to think about that and write that in. Thank you very much. And as you're doing that, I also just want to thank you for joining us. And all of us at the center are really grateful for all of you and the fact that so many of you are thinking and learning and experimenting and taking action. It's very much needed right now. And we're looking forward to seeing what you do next. So we'll keep the chat open for a few minutes if you're still writing, but we will all sign off now and hopefully see you next time. Thank you.